All right, Coaching Leaders podcast is live, and today's episode, I'm really excited and proud about it because I have Kim as my returning guest, and I have Triad as well with us to discuss something that we have to have conversation more frequently about. And today we won't be speaking about Radical Candor book. We won't be speaking pretty much anything about feedback, but we'll talk about the latest book, Just Work, Get Shit Done Fast and Fair. So first and foremost, ladies, thank you very much for sharing your time, being generous with your time and sharing it with me and my audience.
Thank you. We're thrilled to be back.
So literally a few minutes ago, you asked me, Kim, if I read the book, and the answer is yes. And there are so many things that I liked about it, and I'll be sharing as we go through it. But surprisingly to me, the one thing that I picked up and resonated with me the most is a sentence that is inspirational. And I have to be honest, I no longer look for inspirational quotes, although they have the power to lift you off the seat. You don't move the mountains. And I'm well off my seat and I want to move the mountains. But right at the beginning of your book, you've mentioned that to your child, to your kids, that they have inherited a broken world, and you hope that book will present them with tools to continue your work to fix it, to make it better. And it really resonated with me. So I'm wondering, is that the original story behind the book and the company that you've launched?
You know, I think the origin. I wish I could say that it were the origin story, but I think I wrote this book as a result of an experience that I had when I was giving a Radical Candor talk. And I was giving a Radical Candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco, and the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, and was one of too few Black women CEOs in tech. And when I finished the presentation, she pulled me aside. She said, "I really like Radical Candor. I'm excited to put it into practice. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want that'll help us be successful. But," she said, "Kim, I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to put it into practice than it is for you. And I'm willing to bet it's harder for you than it is for your husband, who's a white engineer in Silicon Valley." And she said, as soon as I offer even the most compassionate criticism to someone, I get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And when she told me this, I had several realizations at the same time. The first was that I had not been the kind of colleague that I wanted to be. I had been sort of in denial about the things that were happening to her because, as I mentioned, I had known her for the better part of a decade. And in that period of time, I had never seen her seem even the tiniest bit annoyed. She was always upbeat and cheerful. And believe me, in that period of time, she had what to be pissed off about. And it had never occurred to me, and it should have occurred to me, the toll that must take on her. And so that was the first thing that struck me, was that A, things had been happening to her. B, I had not been the kind of colleague that I wanted to be, because I had been sort of in denial about what was happening to her. And also, I had been in denial about the things that were happening to me. And so obviously, part of my desire to change all this is for her and for myself and for our colleagues, and also for my children. But the impetus of this, of writing the book, was really one of self-exploration and to try to process the things that had happened to me in a way that would help other people process the things that happened to them. So that's kind of the book writing. What about the company? Trier, when I sent her a copy of the book, she said to me, "You know, Kim, I want to get this into as many places as possible. And people don't change their behavior because they read a book." And it's a hard thing for a writer to admit, but I knew it was true. So I'm excited to work with Trier to help people put the ideas in the book into practice.
So Trier, why are you so determined to put it all out there into the world? Because you're right, people don't change because of the book. Books quite often ending up on the shelf, and there is only maybe a quarter of a chapter from each book. If we take and really implement, that's already a success. If I'm honest with you, as if you would only go with a book only. So you're absolutely right. So what drives you so much to really putting it out there into the world, and what resonated the most with you from the book?
Yeah. I think to your point, it ends up on the shelf, and now that's everyone's Zoom backgrounds, and they're color coordinating their books. But what, Kim's superpower that she did with Radical Candor that, we've all seen and familiar with is she just has a talent for giving words and a framework to incredibly nuanced human experiences that we all have. And she's very tactical, but also practical.
Yeah.
And so being a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, there's not a lot of frameworks in this space, right? If you're an engineer, there's lean, there's all these different frameworks you can use. In product, how are you going to PM your product and selling and marketing? But when it comes to DE&I, when it comes to how do we make workplaces equitable, there's a lot of conversations and theoretical thoughts, but what are some frameworks that we can add as leaders into our toolboxes and leverage that to make change so that we can scale it? And so that is what was really powerful to me on the book, is that it was a framework that forced me to sharpen my own perspective of my experiences as a professional, but also take that as a leader to say, oh, these are things I could have done. These are things I should have done and I didn't. And I can be a better leader moving forward because I have these very specific, solutions and tools to use when we're talking about workplace injustices. And not to say that this is a silver bullet, it will solve all the problems, but I hope that this inspires more people to think of frameworks that are, not only name the problem so we can solve it, but then what are the actual solutions that go with it that are very tactical for people? And the book goes very deep, right? And really just provides so many actionable things, regardless of what role you play in these everyday experiences that we have.
Yeah, and the way I like to look at it is what I like, just exactly what you said about the Kim, is the question that I'm asking myself. If I grab the book, what I want is, I don't need a framework in the workplace. I need something that I can pass to my kids. Xavier is 10, Nathan is 17, and it's my moral responsibility to raise them in a way that they're not part of the problem and they're fixing this broken world that they are inheriting, actually. And so talking about the frameworks and the organizational structure without that practicality, it's difficult for me, because otherwise I'm not setting them up for that success. I'm raising them up. I will let them get into organization, crash and burn, so they can finally start having a conversation around the frameworks. I think that's too late. I think we need to really chunk it down, make it so technical and easy. This is what you do when that happens to you. And so I can then take it and go, hey, Nathan, if that happens to you, that's how you should respond, and that's the ways of saying it. And that's what I love about Kim's books. And it's also full of those stories, right, Kim?
Yeah. I mean, I try to write these books almost like a book of short stories, because these incidents are what will help give a framework meaning. So, for example, in the book, part of what I try to do is distinguish between bias, prejudice, and bullying. These are three very different attitudes and behaviors that we often conflate. And so bias is, for my money, just not meaning it. Prejudice is meaning it. And bullying is meaning harm. Meaning harm. And that, or being mean, if you want to think about it that way. And that, to me, is really useful, because you need to respond to each of these things very differently. So one of the things I do, rather than go deep on abstract definitions in the book, is to describe incidents in my life and in my career where these things happen. And then when Trier and I started talking about it, she starts talking about the incidents in her career, which are different than mine, obviously. But that's why I hope this framework is a solve for one, extend to many kind of framework. So, for example, bias, the simple story. And the other thing I'm trying to do with this book, and that Trier and I are trying to do with this company, is to tell more positive stories, because there have been so many stories about what goes wrong. And Trier can explain better than I can what this means, but she's a veteran from the Air Force. She was an officer in the Air Force. And in the Air Force, if you're a pilot and you're flying through dangerous terrain, there's this notion called positive target identification. So rather than looking at the mountain you might crash into, you're going to look at the safe path through. So we're trying to tell more positive target identification stories. So here's one for bias. This friend of mine, Aileen Lee, walks into a meeting with two colleagues who are men, and they sit down at the table and they're waiting for the other side to come in. And the first guy from the other company files in and sits across from one of the men. The second guy comes in and sits across from the other men. And then the rest of the people sit on the edge. So Aileen is off by herself. So it's kind of an awkward seating arrangement in which it's hard for Aileen to get a word in edgewise. But it's her expertise that's really going to win her team the deal. And so she starts talking. And as often happens, all the men on the other side of the table just completely ignore her. It's as though she hasn't opened her mouth. And this is, we all see this. And it happens once, it happens twice. And her colleague, Steve, realizes what's going on. And he stood up and he said, I think Aileen and I should switch seats. And they did. And that was all it took to totally change the dynamic in the room. Because all of a sudden, the other people on the other side of the table realized what they were doing and they stopped doing it. So they didn't mean to exclude Aileen. It was just sort of unconscious bias. And by being an upstander, her colleague did two things. One, he did this because he cared about Aileen. He didn't like the way she was being treated. But two, crucially, he did it because he wanted to win the deal, and he knew that Aileen's expertise was what's going to win the deal. So I think that's part of the notion of just work, is that it's more fair it was more fair for Aileen, but it's also, injustice is terribly inefficient. They weren't going to get stuff done if these guys couldn't listen to Aileen.
Yeah, so when you're talking about the biases now, I'll be totally transparent here and vulnerable. That's as I promised myself. And I have my own share of faults that I've done, especially in the past as a manager, as a leader, as an individual. And I've reflected hard, especially ever since I start doubling down on self-awareness. I really changed the way I think and behave and the way I was raised effectively. But at no point I sat down with myself and thinking, right, if I see 5 black men in hoodies, I'll think about them that way. If I see this happening, this is my opinion about them. And at no point I have decided it, and yet it starts crippling to me on an almost daily basis. And for many years, I wasn't even aware. Thankfully, I've been practicing on my self-awareness, and I thought I got it right. And a few months ago, I had this gentleman, literally my neighbor, who was passing by with this BMW low tinted windows, a black person, and I turned around thinking, dealer. And then I was like, whoa, Raf, like, what if is a person just as like you migrated from different country to fulfill his dream, and his dream is to drive that type of car and work 60, 70 hours a week? Like, why would you even like? I was speechless. I was like, I didn't fix what I thought I fixed. The problem is still there, and I need to battle. So please help me, Tria, Kim. Like, what's happening? I don't want to have it. I'm working hard on it, but it's still freaking there.
Yeah, I'll tell you a story about my bias that I told in the book. So one of the things that I did in the course of writing this book was to hire a bias buster, actually more than one, several people, to read the book and point out problematic language that I was using in the book. Because as we say, with bias, it's unconscious. And so how can we become conscious of what we're unconscious of? It's not easy. So some people I think can go and meditate, be all alone and raise their, but I can't. I need other people. So one of the things I suggest is that you ask people to bust your biases. And if you can afford to pay them, you should pay people to do this. You shouldn't, if I'm concerned about my racial biases, it's not Trier's job to educate me. It's my job to educate myself. So I think that's part of it. But here's what happened. One of the bias busters pointed out to me that I use ableist language. And so I misuse sight metaphors in a way that is biased against the blind. And this was, I really did not want to do this, in part because one of the other people who helped me edit the book is a blind historian, brilliant man, such a clear thinker, really helped me improve the book. So I didn't want to harm him. So it was sort of like the situation with Aileen Lee's business partner. So I really didn't want to harm him. And I also didn't want to use sloppy metaphors. I'm a writer. I really believe that words matter. And so I thought that I had become aware of this as an issue and that I had corrected it. And then right before I handed the book in to my editor, I just did a quick search and for the word see. And guess how many times I misused, I used an ableist, I used see in an ableist way in a 350-page book. 99 times. And so I think it is really important that we recognize how difficult it is to change the way but also recognize that it is possible and we have to keep working at it.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why Trier and I suggest sort of bias interrupters. I'll let Trier explain what those are.
Yes.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing your story and just, being vulnerable and acknowledging this area that you need to continue to work on. And, we say compassionate is the catalyst for change. And also, when we're talking about compassion and empathy don't just come out of thin air, right? It has to stem from something, an experience, a conversation. And so what are the opportunities that you're putting yourself in to ignite this compassion and empathy for you to have these reflections and for you to educate yourself and do the work and to grow? And I also just feel like in this day and age with like Google and resources, and also in this moment where there are so many resources and books and articles and blogs, however you choose to consume your content, to educate yourself and think about your proximity to what's going on so that you can have these reflections. But in the book, in the workplace, we talk about biased interrupters where we have to disrupt the bias and stop it. Even if we're not having the conversation about what that bias is in that moment, but we do have to stop it. Otherwise it will just perpetuate, and silence reinforces, this behavior that we need to change. And so what we need is for these bias interrupters we need a shared vocabulary and then a norm of how to respond. So in the workplace, right? Or even maybe let's say for your family, what is a word or a phrase that when someone says it, there's a shared vocabulary of what it means. So maybe it's like bias alert, or, one of the things that we've seen teams do is say, hey, it's a purple flag. I'm throwing a purple flag. So that when someone says that, everyone knows what that means, that, hey, bias was just exhibited. And now what's the norm of how we're going to respond? And so the norm is, the person who is exhibiting that behavior or attitude to say, hey, I apologize. Thank you for flagging, and I'll do better moving forward. Or if that person doesn't understand, because look, it can be uncomfortable in that moment. And a lot of times we may not understand what someone is flagging as biased, to say, okay, I don't quite understand, what it is that you're calling out right now, but can we connect after the meeting or later on today to have a conversation so that they can interrupt it? And then how do we create that learning moment between these two people to be a shared learning moment for the entire team or organization? And so I think that, for you, I was working with a CEO of a tech company once where we were going over language and defining what prejudice is, what racism is, what white supremacy is. And he was like, Trier, with these definitions, he said, I'm racist. and it was a white male, and he acknowledged powerful how he was racist. And he gave a story about how he took his kids to a baseball game, and after the baseball game was over, there was 3 black men that were walking down the street, and he told his kids, "Hey, let's cross the street." And he said, reflecting back on that, he said in the moment he didn't process it, but reflecting back on it, that was a teachable moment to his kids. Yes. But he was teaching his children. So I think that, like, you know, he had to go and sit down, and he retold that story to his kids. He said, when we do that, I taught you in that moment. I was sharing my prejudice. I was sharing my racism with you and putting that onto you and taking ownership of that. And so I think it is like, we have to have these bias interrupters, right? Like, you noticed that you looked out the window and you had that thought, right? But then what did you do afterwards? Did you go have a conversation with your kids? Did you have a conversation with your wife or with your wife and family, and say, or, you know, your spouse and your family, and say, hey, this is what happened and this isn't okay, but let's have a conversation and talk about why it's not okay?
Yeah. So for me, I choose transparency as one of my core values. And whenever I have a certain conversation with my kids, especially when I'm raising them, I'm bringing all my failure stories raw and on the plate. This is what happened. And so my oldest son heard about it, and not directly after that, but for me, it's about the opportunity and explain, look, this is what I do, this is what happened to me, and this is how I solve it. So I believe when I coach people in giving as much context as possible. I don't have to be right, but I'd like you to see my thought process. And so what I decide to do is to, for the next weeks and time to after that, when I see a person of color, of different religion, different thing, rather than being judgmental, so I celebrate. So I practice for months, for years, not to be judgmental, not to think, oh, why would you wear that? Or why? And I turned the volume up, and I said to myself, I'm going to actually vividly and loud in my mind celebrate that person. So my answer to that was, my logic here is this: if there is a lot of messages bombarding us and shaping this behavior, like this gentleman just crossed the road, he didn't make that decision. It just happened. There is something in this world that keeps on shaping us, and I believe parents have a huge role responsibility in here, even though they're not telling us to be racist. Those small behaviors, when they're commenting news, when they're commenting certain things out loud, or having a beer with friends at home and just commenting things out loud, send certain signals, right? And so for me, with my kids, I would just explain what happened, how I battled. I said, look, this is what I do to challenge myself, and this is my tool. I don't know if it's the best tool, if it's the tool, but this is my answer right here, right now, to really stop being so judgmental. I even have those flash moment thoughts when they happen, because I don't want even that. I don't know if it's possible, goal, if I live in the world that it's impossible, but I don't want those moments to be there. And I'll do everything that I can to make sure that doesn't even cross my mind. I don't want to rely, basically, I don't want to rely on my self-awareness on, oh, I just thought about it, Raf, don't be naughty, move on. I just don't want them even to be created.
I love that. I've never heard that, but I think that's something, thank you for sharing that, because it's something so simple to say, okay, previously I was judging or saying something, but now I find a way to celebrate it, right? And how do I celebrate that difference? And that can just go a long way. And to your point, we have media, and in this time, and social media and all these platforms, and we are bombarded with images. You know, we do a workshop where we give these examples of in media, these, like, what it is, you know, reinforcing these biases and these prejudice that we have, and how do you have to balance that, right? And just to be cognizant of it. And to your point with kids, parents have such a huge role in this. But one of the things that Kim and I talk about is that I'm inspired that, for me, I think that I was raised, my mother raised me of how to treat, the world is going to treat you differently and see you differently as a Black woman. But this is how you have to navigate it, right? Like, this is how you have to get ready for it. Versus, I'm inspired that my nieces and my nephews and my friends' children, we're telling them that you don't have to navigate it. You don't have to take it. Like, you're going to change it, right? You're going to demand things to be different. And I think that's a generational thing. And I'm excited for that, because this younger generation is not tolerating this shit, right? Like, they are putting their foot down and they are demanding something different. And that is incredible. And I think that, you know, if you think about, to your point, this framework, that we have, in this book, and that this company wants to get to as many people as possible. Imagine if we had that at the age of 18 or 21, starting our career. My career would be a lot different because, Kim tells stories in the book, and then I tell stories when we're speaking, that defaulting to silence because we didn't know what to say, because we didn't know what to do, but just even having some simple tools of, hey, when you are faced with bias, use an I statement, invite someone in and let them know how that feels. Hey, I don't feel comfortable working here if this is how you're going to engage with me, right? When you're dealing with prejudice, use an it statement, focus on the prejudice, right? Focus on the prejudice and say, hey, it is not okay for you to, behave in that way, or it is not okay for you to believe that or do that, to discriminate in that way. And then if someone is bullying you, push it away and use a you statement. What's going on with you? You can't talk to me that way. And even those simple things, like, since reading the book, I've used those in my professional life, in my personal life. But we just need to talk about more tactical things that we can do to help us navigate these uncomfortable situations that we know as humans we're going to find ourselves in and day out.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Kim?
No, go ahead.
I'd like to come back to this I and you statements in a minute, but I need to share my thoughts when I read about the buster, the words, the phrase that you can use when you spot the bias. And I can see it work. I like the idea on a personal level, but I can't stop myself from connecting with a feedback methodology and how we tend to share the feedback. And to me, there's a conflict in potentially, or there is the threshold that we need to move through. That is, it is a criticizing people publicly, meaning creating more stress response, and they're more likely stepping into this defensive role because now you're diminishing publicly my social status by calling me out. And so how do we navigate that threshold? Because I'm not saying not doing it, but I'm guessing we need to be a bit more aware when we get to these meetings, when this becomes a thing, so it doesn't look like I'm calling you out in front of everyone just to punish you.
Yeah, it's really important. Obviously, in Radical Candor, I talk a lot about the importance of criticizing in private. Bias interrupters need to happen in public. And it's not a criticism of the person, because we all have biases. And this is why it needs to be a leader-driven initiative, the bias interruption. Because if the team agrees that we are going to interrupt bias and we're going to interrupt it in the moment, and then the team agrees, as Trier said, about how you can respond when your bias has been pointed out to you, either thank you, I won't do it again, or I don't quite understand, can we talk after the meeting? Once this becomes a norm, then it's not as threatening. But and the reason why we've spent most of our time talking about bias, why is it so crucial to interrupt bias in the moment? There's two reasons. Well, there's a million reasons, but I'm going to focus on two. One is that if we don't interrupt it, then it gets reinforced.
Yes.
So if you didn't interrupt your thought process when you saw the man in the BMW, you would have done it again. Yes. And your thoughts might have been made manifest in your actions.
Eventually.
And so that is part of the reason why. If we're going to counteract all of these images from the media, if we're going to counteract the sort of the it's almost like the air we breathe, then we've got to do it in public. We've got to interrupt. And another reason why it's so important is, so in the framework I talk about a bias, prejudice, bullying, and then what happens when you layer power on top of those attitudes and behaviors, and you get discrimination, harassment, and physical violations, including violence. Yes. And we saw tragically last week in the United States how anti-locution, how racist language can wind up causing mass murder, against the Asian American population in Atlanta. And I really believe the path between bias and bias spoken and violence is a well-worn path in history.
Yeah.
And I think it is the job of this century to interrupt that path and block it, because it leads to the most shameful human behavior. And so we can't let it stand.
Yeah, when I was making notes from your book, to me, when you lay down the bias, the prejudice, and the bullying, the way I see it is, if we don't acknowledge and attack that bias and really do something about it, it escalates.
Yeah.
Right. So in the past, I was in a stage when I thought, in fact, acknowledging that I'm a biased person was one of the best decisions that I ever made. But there is more to it, because if I just acknowledge it, it could be an escape route to saying, well, it's not me, it's just our nature. Like, why are you trying to tell me that I have to fight hundreds of thousands of evolution? You know, we all know the work of Daniel Kahneman about, the slow system and the fast one. Well, so what, are you trying to change that? This is the evolutionary, like, we don't try to change me at that level, and that's wrong. I think we need to just acknowledge it and then put really a strong steps, because otherwise it just escalates to this hideous moment when you just mentioned a few minutes ago, that happened last week, and it happens all over the world all the time, unfortunately. So we gotta interrupt that. And there is a small thing that I need to actually ask, and I know I promised to go into the I and you statement, but I'd like to hear your opinion here, and I'm asking it as a male, as a white male, and as a non-English native speaker. I'm finding it challenging to be correct and not to evoke certain responses and thoughts, possibly. I'm finding it challenging to differentiate between female and woman, to the point where I'm getting a little bit overwhelmed and overly concerned which one should I use to make sure I'm on the right path. Because in my native language, although those two do exist, we tend to use just woman. The female part is not being used, and it creates a certain barrier for me where I now don't feel uncomfortable, and I'm retreating to this sort of silence, and I don't know how to navigate through it. Never mind, am I okay to say a Black woman or African American woman? I think that's also part of the problem here, and I would like to learn from you, so I and my listeners can also learn from it. How do I navigate from it, and how do I make you comfortable without striking the chords that I don't really want to and shouldn't?
Yeah. So what I hear is two questions. One is this between women and female, and then, other language of, making people feel comfortable and inviting them in, because we do 2 whole workshops dedicated to language, because language can be that number one barrier to these difficult discussions, these challenging conversations that we need to have to do the work to move forward, right? And I think it's also important that, I saw something on Twitter recently that said non-white people have a PhD in race, and it's about time for white people to do the education and catch up, because we have to share this burden of doing the work. And this is not a sprint or a marathon, because a marathon has a destination. Like, this is work that we have to do for our entire lifetime, every day, and continue to do it. And so, answering your question of, woman and female, there's a lot of thoughts behind this, but I will give one that is important to me is I do my best not to use the term female. So female and male are words that are used in a biological sense for any type of animals. So you could say that's a female dog, that's a female cat, but it's used for animals as well, versus man and woman are used for humans specifically. You couldn't say that's a woman cow or a or a man dog, right? And so sometimes I'll even say that woman engineer, and it may grammatically sound incorrect, because but I do my best not to use female and male for that reason, and that's why there's some sensitivities to it. That's where that comes from. When you said like, oh, Black and African American, I think that this is definitely it's a regional thing, but for the US, what I will say is it's also interesting. In this moment, you'll hear a lot of people talking about the Asian American community, right?
Yes.
different communities' experience of how they got to the US or why they're in the US is very different. And so for me personally, I don't, and I'm a military veteran. So I've said this, and some people are like, Trier, you're not patriotic. Don't even start with me. I've worn this uniform. So like, I don't want to hear that. But what I will say is that as a Black person, part of the diaspora, the African diaspora, I don't like the term African American. I prefer the term Black. It is much more inclusive because we have people from the African diaspora in the US that are not Americans. We have immigrants, we have people from the Caribbean all over. Yes. And so I identify more with my Black community and everyone's experience with that versus the African American experience, which is very nuanced and niche of Black people in America. And so it's much more inclusive. So I tell companies, do not refer to your employees as African Americans because you have Black employees that do not identify as African American. They may be immigrants, they may be from the, all different types of reasons. And so it's just much more inclusive versus if you think about the Asian community and their journey in the US and, assimilation and their history in this country is very different. They came here and they wanted to be a part of America and this American dream versus Black people and descendants, people that were enslaved, we were forced here, right? My family and generation and my ancestors, they did not have a choice. They did not choose to come here. And so it's different histories. And so people have to understand and educate themselves on that to understand that, everyone's journey, every community's journey here is not the same. But the thing with language is, even in the queer community, LGBTQIA+, some people will say, Trier, what do all those letters mean? Well, they're very different and they're nuanced, right? And, one of the things that I really push is that a lot of people will say, oh, the gay community. But gay technically means someone who identifies as a man attracted to another man, right? So if you identify as a woman and you're attracted to another woman, gay does not resonate with you. You're not gay, right? You're a lesbian or you're queer or whatever, your term that you choose. And so again, this is education. So do the work because the information is out there. Understand your proximity to people who are different than you, and learn that so that we can be inviting to people, so that we can have these opening and welcoming conversations. Now, look, I know that I do this work. So when people ask me these questions, I'm not offended, but I do have friends that are like, I'm not here to educate you, right? I'm not here to do the work for you when you have Google. Well, go read a book. And so I also think that there has to be some personal accountability to, not going to underrepresented people and saying, well, what do you think? Teach me, educate me. I'm sure that you all saw, Sharon Osbourne on The Talk. And, when she was yelling at a Black woman, telling her not to cry, she shouldn't be crying. I should be crying because I'm being attacked, but educate me. And then not understanding how much wrong was in that situation where, we are tired. We are tired and we need everyone else to again, do that education, get up to speed and start carrying this burden of the work that we all need to do to make the world and workplaces just better for all of us.
So just a very last thing. So if let's just pretend that I'm the manager and I fired you, Trier, how good idea it is for me to say it out in front. This is the challenge that I'm facing, and how would you prefer to be referred if there is a moment when I have to, because I deliberately try not to, but there are moments when those conversations would have to happen. How good idea is that to preempt it right from the get-go and through the recruitment process and say, hey, I'm aware of those things, but I'm still finding it challenging what's comfortable with you and what you resonate with. Would that be a good idea?
I think what is comfortable is, the more that you share your identities and your language that you use, it's an openness for others, right? So I will say, hey, I identify as a Black woman veteran. I've served in the United States Air Force. This is how I identify. These are my intersections. I live at my intersections every day. That's just my life. Then that opens it up. I think one of the things that, that like white people in particular need to get comfortable with is this otherism, right? It's like, oh, I don't see color. I can't just acknowledge that I'm white, because I can acknowledge, oh yeah, you're different, right? The white is a standard, and then there's other colors or there's other differences, versus it's not right or wrong. It's just like, we all have our race and ethnicities, and we have to be able just to identify as that, you know? And so I appreciate you leading and saying, like, as a white man, right? And so that lets me know that you're comfortable with that. But some people, a lot of white people, feel shame or guilt with that. And it shouldn't be. I don't feel shame and guilt by saying I'm a Black woman, right? I'm proud to be a Black woman. And you can be proud of that, but there's also understanding of history that comes with it, and the privilege, right? Divesting from your privilege, acknowledging your privilege. One of the things that I share about Kim is, I think that Kim just day to day finds ways to actively divest from her privilege. One of the biggest things that, she says, when we were talking about, this company, and she has Radical Candor as a company as well. And when we were talking about what we wanted to do, she said, if I'm going to do this, I want to make sure that the CEO of this company is a woman of color. She set out to do that, right? That's her divesting from this privilege and understanding the benefits of that. And so that is an example of how you can, do that work and show up for others and to give others a platform. And so it can be done, but people just have to take the time to actually care and think through of like, what can I do, right? And what works for one person doesn't work for the other person, because we all live different lives and we all have different opportunities to engage.
Yeah. So let's just get into this technical bits of the I statement. So can you share the story, which I loved, that your daughter told you about, trying to use I statement? I can see why would you coach that, that path of, I feel, I sense this, and she just corrects you in such a way that I was like, it was like, wow. if I was needed by your daughter, I would just high five and I would just say, I adore you. You're brilliant with your thing. For me as an adult, probably I wouldn't come up with this answer and an angle so quickly and clearly. So could you share the story behind, and could you just share with us the I statement, how it works?
Sure, absolutely. So as Trier said before, when you think what's coming at you is bias, you can invite the person in to understand things from your perspective. So Trier said, I don't like being referred to as an African-American woman. I prefer to be referred to as a Black woman. So it was a very simple I statement. And not likely to cause offense or defensiveness on the part of the other person, because she's inviting them in. However, sometimes what's being manifest is not bias, it's bullying. The person is actively trying to be mean, is meaning harm. And this is where my daughter gave me the tool. I didn't give her the tool, actually. So she was getting bullied. She was only in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied on the playground. And I was sort of coaching her to use an I statement. Tell this child, I feel sad when you do that. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, he is trying to make me sad. Why would I tell him he succeeded? And I realized, oh, yes, you're exactly right. You shouldn't tell him he succeeded, actually. And so what you want to do when you think what's coming at you is bullying is push that person away. And a you statement or a you question can do that. So what my daughter and I talked about her saying is, you can't talk to me like that. Or if she was concerned that was going to escalate and encourage him to say, oh, yes, I can, she could say, what's going on for you here? So that she's the idea here is that you're putting the onus on the other person to answer for themselves. So you're no longer on your back foot. You're on your front foot. You're asking the questions. You're not answering the question. So I think that's one way to deal with bullying directly. But Hollaback is an organization that talks a lot about how to deal with bullying. And they point out that you don't always have to, especially if you're the upstander, you don't always have to deal with bullying directly. You can sometimes delay, or you can focus on the person who's harmed as opposed to focusing on the bully. So a friend of mine told me a story over the weekend about being on a flight, and there was one guy on the flight who was a bully. He was being a jerk to the flight attendant, and demanding, kind of like peel my grape, please, kind of ridiculousness. And she was doing a good job sort of balancing his ridiculous demands with making sure that everybody on the flight had what they needed. And eventually towards the end of the flight, this guy just was like, I think they didn't have the kind of wine he wanted or something. And he was like, this is the worst service I ever got. I'm going to get you fired. You know, he was just being a jerk. And one of the passengers stood up. He just ignored, you know, it's one of those moments where everybody kind of feels like they ought to intervene. But too often we all serve as the silent bystander in the case of bullying. So he stood up and he said to the flight attendant, I want to let you know that this is one of the best flights I've ever been on, and you've done a great job. And this is my business card. And if anyone tells you you didn't do a good job on this flight, I want you to have them call me. And then once he did that for her, everyone around stood up and gave this flight attendant their business card and said, this was great. And I'm gonna stand up for the fact that you offered great service. And this was very effective. It was not exactly a you statement, but it was a very effective way to combat the bullying on the flight. Because the not only did the flight attendant feel supported, but the guy, the bully, shut up in the moment. And my hunch is he hesitated before behaving that way again in the future. So I think the more stories we can tell like that, the more positive target identification stories where people get it right, the better. The more we can know what to do when we observe bullying or when we're being harmed by bullying.
Yeah, so I like the dynamic between I and you when you combine it together, because you express what's important to you and you put it back on the other person. And when you ask what makes you think, what makes you believe that you can behave that way, or what's in you that tells you to behave that way, it's very powerful. It stops people in tracks, number one, because nobody asks those questions back to you. I think those who did bullying, then they probably wouldn't expect that sort of comeback. Right?
Yeah.
I can only imagine that this is really puts it on you, versus like the way I imagine it, then in the workplace, often the conversation is like, because I'm your boss, because I'm your manager. But if you really bring this conversation to what's you as a person makes you believe to behave that way, then it's a completely different conversation here, right?
Yeah. And also, really, in my experience, anytime someone says, I can be mean to you because I'm your boss, like that person just has lost all credibility. That's
for sure.
That's the end.
For sure. Because my background is hospitality, and the way I always also like to explain things in terms of food quality, but then also in behaviors, is to bring it in. Would you be comfortable with your daughter, your mother being and having that meal or being treated that way? So kind of like, for my version of you is bringing it into as emotionally close to you, but to your personal life versus to your professional life, because I'm the boss. So I've been told to do so. I mean, that's how I've been trained. What were you on about? There's a clear ladder here. So stop rumbling and I'm your boss, that sort of thing. That brings it completely different emotional level for me and from my experience in that matter here.
Yeah.
There is also in your book, there is a part of the conversation that is about systems in place. And I found myself irritated at some point. And it's on me. It's because I think we have too many conversations that what's the system to follow in HR when things happening to do so. And for me, the way I look at life and the way I coach managers when I was the manager and raising my kids is like, I'm not raising my kids to don't hurt people because it's against the law and there are low consequences. I'm teaching you because it's immorally wrong. In the workplace, which seems to majority of the conversation is you don't do that because here are the consequences. There is not enough conversations of immoral part of that. And so I had to check myself. I'm like, okay, those are important. So let's break them down. What are the systems in place that we can put in our workplace to support the diversity and inclusivity, to create a more inclusive environment?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that are really important in order to interrupt the kind of bullying behavior that you just described, where I'm talking to you this way because I'm your boss. The problem with power is that it corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely, but a little bit of power corrupts a lot, actually. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do as leaders is to put in place checks and balances. Mm-hmm. Because when people get a little bit of power, it is incredible to me how quickly they start to abuse that power. Mm-hmm. So, and it really doesn't, there was a terrible story in the New York Times about a manager at Ford Motor Company who had absolute power over who got which shifts on his team. And there was a woman, a single mom, who was working, and he said to her, he used this power in the following way. He went to her and he said, if you don't sleep with me, I'm going to put you on the earliest shift, and there's no daycare available for your children at that shift. So you're going to have to, and so, but there was no one for her to go to say what he had done. There were no checks and balances on that power of, and so that's an extreme example, but it's also not that extreme, unfortunately. It's a kind of junk that happens all the time. And so checks and balances are vital to combat powerful people bullying less powerful people in your organizations. And as an entrepreneur, I've never liked to think about it this way, but I think it's important to consider, like, when you start a company and you decide you design all these systems over who gets hired, who gets fired, who gets promoted. Mm-hmm. You are creating kind of like a Stanford prison experiment. Hopefully you're designing things so that you don't get such terrible behavior as you got in the Stanford prison experiment, but you have to consciously design your systems to combat injustice, because otherwise you're going to get systemic injustice. But if you design your systems better, you get systemic justice.
Yeah, I suppose it's me filtering things through my own experiences and how I would challenge things, forgetting that not everyone is like me and is able to do certain things like me, and I'm in a completely different position as well. And like I said, I always lean back on my athlete background sort of thing. And unfortunately, on a few occasions, I would just resort to more of a power than actually a conversation. But that's just completely different conversation. But I've learned to do better. I've learned to.
It's really
to challenge people through my own sort of not work thingy, but as a person. Like, if you talk to me like that, we're gonna have a serious problem, and I will do whatever it takes here and now. That sort of thing. And I'm not a better person today, and in better control of my emotions, and not leaning on the power versus what's the right thing to do.
Well, I think also even good people in a bad system do bad things, and so I tell a bunch of stories in the book about times when I, as a leader, like, in part of the reason I started this software company called Juice that I started was because I wanted to create a more just working environment, and I failed to do that. I created an environment in which several women wound up getting harassed. And I didn't take I didn't design the system so that stuff couldn't happen. And I should have. So Triera and I have talked a lot about the ways that you can actually quantify your bias at every step of the employee life cycle to make sure that these kinds of things aren't happening.
Yeah, we're running out of time here, but I'd like to touch on that recruitment process, because there is a story of this orchestra that you shared, and I would love to hear your stories here. Your thoughts, because I came across, and I thought maybe it's a good idea, but I have no experience, haven't tried it, haven't seen it working or not. There are now companies and managers who would put a system in place when they're hiring, when the CV doesn't have a name or there is no indicator of your gender and where you're coming from, potentially. What are your thoughts with that process? Is it how good that idea is? And if it is, what's the reason behind it?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic idea in theory. It just doesn't scale. And I know this very personally, but if someone's looking for a startup company, trust me, this is something that would make you a lot of money. There's no tool out there that allows organizations that are screening hundreds, thousands of resumes a day to, remove all of those things that would that could cause any type of bias, right? And if you think about all of the places where that could be, like even, on my resume, I was part of like a women's group in college, and that's on my resume. So that you'd have to blind that. Are you going to blind all the previous work locations, all of these things? Eventually, if you do that, it just doesn't scale. Is it a good idea? Yes. If you're able to do that on a smaller scale for smaller teams, I think that's fine, but it just doesn't scale in theory. And so it's really, really hard to do. However, one of the ways that we can do that, though, is with my recruiting teams. I think that I always, like, when I go and even now and I interview, I don't look at a resume. I don't need a resume. I feel like a resume is for the recruiter to understand, should the recruiter start having a conversation. But once a recruiter comes and puts someone on my calendar and says, hey, we want you to interview this candidate, I trust my recruiting team that this person is worth my time. And so I go into interviews and I say, hey, just let you know, I don't know your resume. I don't know where you're currently working. I know nothing about you. And it's so interesting how that changes the dynamic of the conversation, because the person, there's like this weight lifted off of them. And then they can tell me what's important for that role. Because sometimes maybe half of what's on your resume is not relevant to the conversation that we need to be having to understand if you can be value add in the role that we have for you. And so what are things that you can change in your process to say, okay, we know that there's bias within resumes. So like recruiters, I understand, need to screen and have that first screen. But after that, does a hiring manager really need to see a resume if they have a good working relationship with their recruiter and the recruiter is giving them the information that they need? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on how much you're hiring, depends on, again, like the scale. But there's things that you can do you're never going to eliminate bias. And there's no tool out there. Anyone that says we're going to eliminate bias, we're human. We're going to show up with that. But how do we put things in place to reduce that bias at every step of the way, right? And even something as simple as, we did this at an organization. We kept finding that when men would interview in the debrief, people would give feedback. I can't wait to go grab a beer with him. Like, he's great. But no one would ever say that about women. Women candidates would come through the process and no one ever said, she was great. I can't wait to go grab a beer with her, right? And so we started training our teams that when someone says that is of no value add to the feedback. Like, let's remove that, right? Or the other one is they're not a culture fit. I always eliminate the F word, fit, because there's so much that can hide behind that. What does that even mean? So when someone says, oh, I don't think that they would be a good culture fit on the team, dig into that. What are you saying? Force someone to name what they're talking about, and you'll find that people get really uncomfortable very quickly because that's where a lot of their bias is sitting and they're hiding behind.
Yeah. The question, I mean, the sentence about going out, grabbing a beer with someone is the equivalent to crossing the street, basically. You have entire team listening to it. And so what you say, I call those things, I call it passive feedback. Like all the things that we do, speak, how we behave, even how we're sending the emails, there is some passive feedback there, right? That says something is more important to me than the other thing. And when the employee enters your workplace and they watch, especially right at the beginning. So you hear those conversations, you hear those sentences. It's like, oh, male dominated. Oh, going for beer, being cool is more important than actually being a female, woman who is in the army, in the Air Force. Like, how does that, like, there is no even comparison, like being cool and going for the beer and somebody who went through all those ranks and was in the Air Force is like, that's what we should celebrate and have a conversation with. And that's the reason why I'm getting it, because I see perseverance, I see grit, I see all those beautiful and wonderful things, which ties me to the point. I wouldn't want someone to cross it out, like you've mentioned from your resume, because I'm looking for perseverance, I'm looking for resilience here. And if you've done coaching in a sport, if you've done this, if somebody tells me I was in ballet, I'm like, we are having conversation here, because nobody works as hard as somebody who was in ballet from early age for 10 years. Like, you are already, in my opinion, well ahead in terms of resilience and possibly most people around you, right? So yeah, that's I love your
and ballet dancers could be men too. There's plenty of
same thing. Exactly.
So I think that some of the teams that I have seen make the most progress on recruiting did do an experiment where they got the people who were sourcing the resumes they stripped out personally identifiable information before the sourcers chose the resumes, and they did an experiment where at one point they didn't strip out personally identifiable information, and in the next round they hired an intern with a Sharpie to scratch out all personally. So it didn't scale. But then they learned that once the personally identifiable information was stripped out of the decision-making process about whether to bring this candidate in or not, that the sourcers brought in more women and people of color. And so that was an example of stripping out PII to personally identifiable information to identify bias in the sourcing process. And that was really important because then the sourcers realized that they had been selecting more white men than they should have. That there were more candidates who were qualified that they were missing because of their bias.
It shows very well that we don't want to be part of the problem, but it shows that actually we all are, and we all have work to do.
I mean, the sourcers were not fired for this, but they were educated. And that's why it's so important to measure the bias.
Yes.
We're about to wrap up, but there is one question that I always ask. And so, Trier, the first question for you is, who is the best coach-like leader that you worked for or with?
Who's the best coach-like leader that I've worked for and with? I would say Anilu Vasquez. Anilu Vasquez is the CHRO at TPG now. She was the previous chief diversity officer at Goldman, and I had the opportunity to work under her. And just an empathetic leader, but holds you accountable and calls you out, and just made me, so much of who I am today as a professional is from her. So any opportunity that people have to consume any content, podcasts or interviews or articles that she does, Anilu Vasquez at TPG now, she is just fantastic.
Awesome. And for you, Kim?
You know, I'm going to tell a story about Trier as a great leader. This is very recent and very dear to me. So I had to fly to Memphis recently. My father had just gone into hospice, and I talk a lot of talk about work-life balance and making sure you're taking care of yourself. But I was not taking care. I was trying to work at the same time that I was trying to be present for my father. And Trier sent me a text, and she said, "I mean this with love, Kim, but you must stop working." And then she just pulled everything off of my calendar. And I'd never worked with anybody who took me in hand in quite the same way and reminded me of what is most important. So I'm really grateful to be working with Trier.
Wow, awesome share. Fantastic. Wow, what a way to wrap up the episode, and where we can learn more and connect with you. I know the Just Work has its own website and stuff. Is there actually a hashtag that you have just for yourself? Because if I want to do something with the Radical Control, I know where to find it. What about
hashtag Just Work? Hashtag Just Work. And you can also visit the website at justworktogether.com. So information on, and go get the book. The book is out now, so everyone should go get it. And check out the website, learn more about the framework. And then also there's a place on the website where people can put their own stories, their own bias, prejudice, bullying, stories. And so we'd love to have other people's stories that really just bring the framework to life.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time today. I've learned so much, and I become a better human being as a result of it, because there were some questions and things that I needed to have answered for myself, but also for the audience, so we can all learn from our own and my mistakes, I hope, at least. So thank you very much for your generosity of your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.